Good afternoon. My name is Tim Lynch. I'm your host of LGBTQ Legal Lines. Legal Lines is brought to you by the LGBTQ Bar Association. My guest here today is Charles Lerner. He's the Executive Director of Boston CASA. And by way of, before we go any further with the program, I should tell you I've been personally involved with CASA since 1991. I've been a CASA volunteer, I've been on the board of directors, and I've been president of the board since the year 2000. And I brought Charles on the program partly because we've discussed over the past year the problem of the explosion of LGBTQ homeless youth throughout the country, and indeed in Massachusetts and Boston. And one of the things that was in the works were protocols, and interestingly enough, the protocols which are now being used throughout the Commonwealth originated in part from Charles. So I thought it was a good idea to bring him on to talk to us about what Boston CASA is all about, and to explain what the protocols are and why it's important to have these protocols. Charles, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you, Tim.
So why don't we first start out by telling the audience exactly what is Boston CASA?
Sure, so Boston CASA is Boston's location of a national organization that has over 900 locations, began in Seattle in the mid-1970s by a juvenile court judge who was really concerned that he was making drastic or dramatic decisions on behalf of children and families within cases that were involving abuse or neglect with very little information. He said, I have about 5 minutes to make this big decision, and I don't have all the information I need to make it. So he was out of the box in his thinking and thought of utilizing volunteers within the court system. And so here we are since 1977, now at 900, almost 950 programs across the country. So there are 5 programs across the Commonwealth, Boston being one of them. And we recruit, train, and supervise advocates who are appointed by a juvenile court judge to simplify it, to look after the best interests of children in foster care, to make sure they don't slip through the cracks of the system. So.
And to put more of a fine point, they're appointed as a guardian ad litem. They have a court order.
Right.
And so they have access to everything about the children.
Right.
And they use that access, and they do periodic reports for the court.
Right, and unlike social workers, attorneys, pretty much any professional on the case, these volunteers are typically assigned one case at a time. So you can imagine, think about an attorney or a social worker who only has one case to work on every week. The amount of work that they're able to accomplish because they can be so focused on one child or maybe multiple children within a sibling group. So they're able to do some things, I think, that the professionals in the field find it difficult to do just because of a lack of time. So
Yes, and in my own personal experience, I remember I was on one case that was, unfortunately, the children were in and out of care a lot. And so the department, now they call them the Department of Family and Children's Services, had literally volumes of records on the family. And of course, a social worker who has 14, 15, 18 cases doesn't have the luxury of time to even go through those records. Right. And that's what a CASA does. A CASA has one case, a CASA goes through all the records, summarizes them, right, and makes these reports.
Right, and we are able to provide a lot of information to the court so the court can make more well-informed decisions, which is, on the end of the continuum, obviously a very important contribution. But what we tell our volunteers is don't minimize the things that you're doing that seem so small, even if it's something as simple as making sure that a youth who is just keeping their head above water, who are really struggling during a very challenging time, that they're connected to an extracurricular activity, for example, that's going to really give them a sense of belonging and purpose, making sure that I would say that I've had multiple cases, even just in the last couple of weeks, believe it or not, where we have youth that are waiting 6 to 8 weeks for eyeglasses, having a hard time seeing in the classroom, and because of mass health and the bureaucracy of the system, they have to wait a month or two. And in those types of cases, CASA has intervened, found a donor, and just said, you know what, we're going to buy the glasses ourselves. We're not going to wait for 2 months for this child to get glasses. And as our executive director, you know, my philosophy has always been on a day-to-day basis in our advocacy for the children we serve is what would we expect for our own children within our own family, and that's what we should be advocating for. It's unacceptable that children who are part of this system have to go without sufficient clothing, medical care. We've been on cases where we've reviewed files, determined after looking at medical records that a physician has, you know, made a referral for a follow-up neurological appointment or some other type of evaluation that never got followed up because in the meantime, a child moved to a new home or had a new social worker, and it completely falls through the cracks, and it's just not acceptable. So that's why we're there, is to really look after these kids. And I think what I say to our colleagues who are attorneys or social workers or the paid professionals on these cases, that in considering the current state of affairs in this state, and we're trying together to figure out how to reform the system in a way that's going to work more for children and families. I don't think we can do it without the community. I don't think we can do it without volunteers and citizens within the Commonwealth stepping forward and contributing in some way.
Yeah. And you've emphasized a few points I'd like to bring out. First of all, everybody's a volunteer. I've been a volunteer.
Okay.
And everybody who works in the organization, who comes in and does this good work, they're the everyday people.
Right.
They don't need to be a lawyer. They could be, and as long as they go through the screening and training, they can be a CASA.
Right.
Which I think is wonderful, first of all. I mean, so if people out there are listening and they don't like the current state of things, I encourage you to look up Boston CASA and see if that's a good fit for you, and you could do something.
Well, and one thing I will say, Tim, if I can interrupt you, is,
Sure.
is that there is often, I have been a clinical social worker and was a therapist working with families involved in the system, and now I've been in management for almost 10 years in this field. And when I came to CASA about 5 years ago, I started in California and moved here to Boston. There is often an uphill battle for credibility for volunteers involved in the system. And so some folks will say, you know, what are volunteers really bringing that social workers and attorneys and, you know, cannot collectively bring to the table? And, you know, keeping in mind that I've been involved in the system in one way or another my whole life, and as you know, been in foster care myself and adopted and know the system from that perspective, and as an adoptive parent, even I know that what citizens bring to the system that is important is they bring a sensibility sometimes that we lose sight of because we go on vacation, we leave our jobs, we get overwhelmed, you know, there's issues around money and bureaucracy, and what our advocates say is, I understand all that. I know the social worker went on vacation, is on medical leave. I know you don't have the money to do this. I know you're overwhelmed. I know you have 20 cases, and there is a child here that has a need that's not being met. Let's work together to get it figured out. And so that's what volunteers bring to the table.
They humanize the process.
Exactly.
That's what I always like to say. They humanize the process, and they bring to the court, to the system, that continually bring to the court and system,
Right.
that all these children, every single one of them matter.
Right.
And you've hit upon it a couple of times, is the continuity issue, which I think is important because these cases are supposed to go for 18 months, but can go on a lot longer. Right. And one CASA, one case, but during the pendency of that case, there could be multiple attorneys, multiple social workers.
Right.
And that's, as you've mentioned, it's very problematic.
Right.
You know?
It's having lived it myself and witnessed it, you know, with hundreds of kids, hundreds of children and youth. You know, it is such a vulnerable time for these children. You feel completely powerless. I think most of our children and youth will say this. You feel powerless. You feel like you have no voice. You know, many of our youth are hanging on by a thread, and they need somebody that's going to be their champion, that's going to, you know, speak up for them, and care enough to. You know, one of the things, sometimes our advocates get very, you know, angry and emotionally invested, and some people say you can't get overly emotionally invested here. Well, you know, children need us to be overly emotionally invested. They need someone, and if their parents are not available to be that person, some of our children don't have that with their parents. They need someone to do it, and so our CASAs, I think, provide that a lot of times.
That's right. And I think it's remarkable, and you've emphasized this, but it deserves that. The child will know, after the child grows up, that during the course of a very difficult time in my life, there was an individual who volunteered their time, wasn't paid,
Right.
volunteered their time to do this type of thing. I think that's incredibly meaningful.
Right.
And the issue, the other issue you've raised, and I'd like to emphasize this a little more, is the advocacy. Are the educational medical needs being met?
Right.
And things, for one reason or other, get lost in the bureaucracy and the shuffle. And that's what a CASA does. A CASA aggressively goes in, investigates, and then sees, what's missing with respect to the educational plan for this child, the medical plan. Are people following up? Why not? So,
well, and
critical.
and there are times, I've worked with social workers, and I give them feedback. It's amazing to me how, and attorneys for that matter, it's amazing to me how you have your finger on the pulse of what's going on with these kids, like you do. I just was talking to an attorney the other day within our court who, she gets up there and she passionately delivers, an argument on behalf of her clients, and she knows those kids so well, and there's a lot of cases, and it's remarkable to me when I see that. But then there are other cases where we work on where we feel like folks are so out of the loop, they really don't know what's going on with these children. So, sometimes the system works, and sometimes it just doesn't. And
that's why you need a volunteer in every case.
I think so. I have found, I do a self-assessment as our executive director where I go case by case and I say, have we worsened this situation? Have we really done nothing to improve it and just maintain it? And have we improved it? And I will say that when I look at those numbers, and of course I'm not objective entirely, but when I look at those numbers, I would say that typically about 90% of the time, I think we improve the circumstances of a youth or a family by being on a case. And I put those numbers against really anybody involved on these cases. I think our efficacy 9 out of 10 times is an argument that that most cases would benefit from having a volunteer GAL on it.
And I think one of the sayings of a CASA is that I speak for this child.
Right.
They go into a courtroom, they have met with this child. They've met with this child multiple times, and they ask age-appropriate questions, and when they come into a courtroom, they can tell the judge, what does the child think about what's going on?
Right. But importantly, what attorneys will say is, I speak for what the client wants, right? And our volunteers do that to a certain extent as well, but sometimes they speak for the child in a different way. Our advocates are appointed for best interests. And here in Massachusetts, children are appointed counselor, appointed an attorney that speaks on behalf of their wishes, right? And that's an important distinction is that sometimes our volunteers go to court and they say some things that perhaps lead to children not getting necessarily what they want. But how I respond to that is that we can't always give kids what they want.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have to stand up and say, and this is what parents do all the time for their children.
Yes, exactly.
I know you want to have ice cream at 9 o'clock at night before you go to bed, but here's why you can't do that. I know you don't want to go to school. I mean, I just had this conversation yesterday with my little one. I know you don't want to go to school, but when you get older, do you want to be able to buy things for yourself? And he's like, yes. Do you want to have a car? Yes. Well, you have to be able to get a job, and here's why you go to school, so you can get a job. We have to have that conversation. So we can't always give our kids what they want. Sometimes we have to be the adult. So I think that's our volunteers do that.
Yeah.